Thank you very much for reading it with such difficult names. So, what have we got here? We've found out something about Luke, and now we've got just 6 verses that he's going to tell us something in. The first section, the difficult section to read, is all about Luke being a historian. He's telling us the date that something happened. But rather than simply saying this happened on Tuesday morning, the 10th of whatever it might be, he gives us a way of dating it. And he goes to really quite extreme lengths. He tells us, first of all, that there is a way of dating it by looking at the world order. So he's looking at it from the events of the Roman Empire. That's sort of as big as they looked. So the first date comes from the world situation. The second date, but when I say the second, there's actually 4 of these that he puts forward, is to do with Palestine itself. So he tells us who the different leaders are of the various sections of Palestine. When Herod the Great died, Herod was the person who was king and in charge when Jesus was born. He divided up Palestine to several of his sons, who, confusingly, several of them were also called Herod, so it does become slightly confusing. But they're divided up, and different sons take different parts of Palestine. One of the sons, none of them were particularly good, but one of them was such a disaster that the people rose up and got rid of him, and a new person was put in charge, and that was Pontius Pilate. So Luke's dating tells us about the Roman Empire and who's in charge there, who the Caesar is, and also tells us in the local situation who the different leaders are, and even gets right the person who was taken out of a ruling and the person who was put in charge. So we've got 5 different dates of 5 different ways of dating what happened. And he then tells us about the Jewish situation, the religious situation that Jewish people found themselves in. And he tells us that there are 2 high priests. There's Annas and there's Caiaphas. Now, if you were going to pick holes in Luke as a historian, you could look at this and say, he's wrong. There's only ever 1 high priest. He says there are 2, Annas and Caiaphas. You say he's a historian, maybe he's not a very good historian. But when you delve into that just a little bit more, we discover that sometime previously, Annas had been the high priest, and then he'd stopped, and one son had taken over. He stopped, another son had taken over. And Caiaphas is actually his son-in-law. So when Luke says there are 2 high priests, what he's saying is Caiaphas is the high priest, but Annas has sort of never stopped being high priest. He was still behind Caiaphas, pulling the strings of influence, as it were. So when he said there were 2, in practice there were 2, because one person had the name and the title and the job, and the other person had all of that and was still very influential. So the first part of our reading, we saw Luke as the historian. He dates this really, really accurately. He tells us about the world situation, he tells us about the local situation, and he tells us about the religious situation. So much dating. I wonder whether it's simply dating. If we look back, which we can't do now, and see what he says about Jesus' birth, all of which is important, it is not dated as carefully as this. It's as though even though these are mere dates, he's still giving us a message. He's still telling us that this is a critical turning point in the history of the world. He's saying the coming of Jesus was important, but the beginning of Jesus' ministry is even more important. And he's going to take time, he's going to put in detail, he's going to take care to make sure we know when that happens. And we can date that, if you put all of those together, it comes out between AD 27 and AD 29. So we can put some reasonably clear dating on when Jesus' ministry started. So in these 6 verses that we've got, the first 2 are taken up with a very obvious example of Luke being a historian, but a message being put through, even through what might appear just to be mere facts. The second thing, though, that we need to look at is Luke as a theologian. So the first thing to say is what we've looked at already. This, with John the Baptist appearing on the scene and Jesus close behind, this is a world-changing event. Okay, this is critical to what happens from now on. The second thing that we learn is that John the Baptist comes with a message of repentance and forgiveness of sins. John says to the people, how are you living your lives? What are you doing? How are you treating people who don't have as much as you? He says particularly to the religious leaders, how are you telling people of God? Where is the message of love? And he pulls people up short in the demands and the expectations he has of them. And then comes, following repentance, then comes forgiveness and baptism as a sign of that. And then perhaps the bit to hold on to as we're moving into Advent. He tells us that Jesus was coming in God's glory and preparations are required for his coming. This is what Luke writes. As it is written in the book of the words of Isaiah the prophet, a voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. Every valley shall be filled in, every mountain and hill made low. The crooked roads shall become straight, the rough ways will become smooth, and all people will see God's salvation. So these are words from hundreds of years before John the Baptist. These are words of the prophet Isaiah, written when God's people feel geographically and spiritually a long way from God. When Isaiah spoke, it was the habit, if a king was going to go and visit some place of his kingdom, that he would send out a messenger. He'd send out a courier and say to them, get ready, I'm coming. Make the place ready for me. Literally, make sure that the roads are such that the chariots can come along there. And that's the message that Isaiah had for God's people then. And that's the message that Luke decides to include at the time that John the Baptist starts to preach and starts to teach and starts to tell people of the coming of Jesus Christ. He says to them, make the way straight. Get rid of the bumps. The chariot needs to come through, although Jesus more often rode on a donkey. We need to make way because the King is coming. And on this Advent Sunday, as we look forward to Christmas, but 4 weeks away, and think of all that we have to do and all the important things that we have to do. You know, I sometimes feel uncomfortable when we say, you know, all the practical things, but it's more important that we do that, which tends to suggest, a bit like Martha, that the other things are not important. They are important. We're making Christmas a good time for other people and for ourselves. But alongside those preparations, let's keep in the back of our minds that John the Baptist said, make way, make the paths clear. And maybe sometimes we need just to stop and pause and think, where are the bumps in our road? Where are the sharp turns? Where are the troughs that a chariot can't go through? What is it that we need to make straight so that on Christmas Day we can be ready to worship as we reenact and remember that Jesus Christ came as King through a straight road. So before we sing again, let's just pause for a prayer.